So today I'm going to be talking about post-publication critiques in psychology journals. As Paulina and Leanne mentioned, this is coming from my first paper, which was part of my honours project at University of Melbourne, and I'm now in Sydney. I want to start off by acknowledging all the wonderful people who helped out on this project, particularly supervisors Tom Hardwick and Samin Vizier, who were really amazing to work with, and all the co-authors who participated in this. Honours was a really difficult year, and having such an amazing team to work with, really helped get me through it and helped me get to where I am today. So thank you. So for this study, the first thing we need to do is, when we're talking about post-publication critique, we first need to define it, because there's several different ways that people can define post-publication critique. But for the sake of this study, we used a very strict operational definition because we really wanted to focus on journal accountability. So we used this definition that came from a previous work by my supervisor, Tom Hardwick, around any journal-based avenue for sharing peer-initiated critical discourse related to specific research articles, so not just general topics, and it had to be published in the same journal as the original article. So this can include types like commentaries, which tend to be kind of longer format critiques, letters to the editor, which can be shorter comment critiques, and also web comments, which are more informal kind of forms of critique. So the first two differ a little bit in that they generally receive their own DOI, so they are kind of registered within the academic literature, whereas web comments usually aren't and can be more informal. Of course, none of these are necessarily critiques, but they can include critique types. So it had to be, what we were looking for was specifically critical discourse in one of these types. So it excludes specifically invited commentaries because we wanted it to be peer initiated. It excludes corrections and retractions, even though these can come from critiques. And it also excludes things like pub peer comments, which are hosted on external websites. So one example of post-publication critique that you may be familiar with is the quite famous rapid response system from the British Medical Journal. So this is a really good example of how a critique system can work. This works as a two-tier system. It was originally introduced in 1998, so probably one of the first of its kind, I think, to introduce critiques in this format, where readers could leave web comments, and this included critiques, but again, doesn't have to be critical, on articles. So it was the first time that readers had a chance to just quickly respond to articles that they read. Didn't necessarily have to be from other academics in the field. And in fact, there's been a lot of positive feedback about medical participants or participants in medical studies using this format to talk about their experiences in studies, which has been really good. And then with this system, some of these web comments can become formalized as letters after being reviewed by an editor, and then they're actually indexed in PubMed. So they do become formalized within the literature. In this particular system, they have a 600-word comment, and that drops down to 300 for when they're formalized as letters. And importantly, there is no time limit on when people can submit these critiques. So this is kind of what the rapid response system looks like. So you can see there's a responses tab on the article, and then people can respond to the responses, and you get some pretty interesting discussions happening. In fact, this system was so popular that it received 20,000 comments in its first 4 years of being active. So it just shows a really good example of how post-publication critique can function when well executed. So why is post-publication critique important? Well, I want to talk about Robert Merton, who you might be familiar with from the Mertonian norms around how we interact with science or what the kind of principles of science should be. And I love this quote that, the abuse of expert authority and creation of pseudosciences are called into play when the structure of control exercised by qualified compeers is rendered ineffectual. Now, when we think about the structure of control and, qualified peers, we think about, I think about peer-reviewed literature. So we often hold peer review as being the gold standard for science. That's the system through which articles can become published. But I think a few people would happily argue that it has been rendered ineffectual. You don't have to look too far to find articles kind of critiquing this. And I think, especially in recent years with the rise of AI, and things like paper mills, we are seeing more and more problems arise with this kind of traditional peer review system. Although it's still inarguably quite important, it's not really sufficient as a mechanism for control, and especially not as a mechanism for self-correction. And so post-publication critiques can actually help shape science. And we have a very famous example of that. So some of you might be familiar with this controversial article, which was published in 2011, where the author claimed to have found evidence that people could predict the future. And this article inspired this probably even more famous response. So this is a great example of a typical post-publication critique, according to our definition. In fact, these two articles were published side by side in the same journal. And what was really striking about this critique was that it pointed out that many of the questionable methods used by Daryl Bem in the original study were common practice throughout psychology. So it was this critique that sparked widespread recognition of what we now all know as the replication crisis. Yet, despite the notoriety of this exchange, there is actually very little research around how post-publication critiques function in practice. So what do we currently know about post-publication critiques? Well, this is the original study by Hardwick et al., where they looked at just the top 15 journals across a number of different disciplines to see kind of what the policies and practice of critiques were. Now we can see here that in general, among all these journals, there was around 63% had some kind of explicit policy for post-publication critiques. And then down here, they combined the psychology and psychiatry fields together, as that is how it is indexed in Clarivate. And they found that they were a little bit better, with 67% of those journals accepting critiques, but still not as good as like clinical medicine, for example, where pretty much every journal they've looked at accepted some kind of critique. When they were looking at prevalence, they had a primary method, which in the new study we call the linked method. So this is articles, when they looked at the articles, they tried to see, are there any links to critiques on this article? Is there any indication of critiques happening? And then the secondary estimate we call instance method in the new article was when they looked at a sample of articles from the journals included, how many of them were themselves critiques of another article. And so they found 5 and 17% respectively of these two different types, which is not too bad. It's still fairly rare, but I would say particularly the 17% estimate, that's quite a good number of critiques. But again, this is only in 15 journals. From memory, I think 9 of them were psychiatry journals and only 6 were psychology journals, and it's just the top 15 according to journal impact factor. So we wanted to then focus just on psychology to see how post-publication critiques are being handled in these journals. So we had 2 main populations of interest. So first, we took all psychology journals, and then second, we looked at just the prominent psychology journals. And we looked at 2 different aspects, both policy and prevalence. So for policy, we selected 100 journals at random, and then we also ordered the journals according to their impact factor, which we know is a flawed system, but in terms of prominence, it's kind of the easiest metric we can find. And so we looked to see explicitly whether they had something stating that, yes, we are open to publishing critiques. And then if they did, we also recorded any limits imposed, such as word count or time to submit. Then for prevalence, we randomly sampled empirical articles from the entire psychology literature, and then we also randomly sampled just from the prominent journals. And then among these articles, we searched for any links to or examples of the published critiques. So for the results, when it came to journal policy, Among the 100 randomly selected psychology journals, only 23 had explicit post-publication critique formats listed among their accepted article types. So this was slightly better when we looked at the most prominent journals, with 38% having some kind of policy in place. Yet that still seems pretty low. And I do want to mention here as well that 11 journals were actually included in both samples. So we do still have kind of prominent journals included in the randomly selected journals. When it came to the limitations, as you can see, the majority of critique formats in both the samples provided some kind of indication of word limits, usually quantitative, with commentaries being around 2,000 words, roughly twice as long as letters to the editor, which were roughly 1,000 words in the randomly selected journals and around 800, so a little bit shorter in the prominent journals. Though it was really unsurprising that these were longer, because as we were kind of harmonizing the names, there are many different names for the article types, and we harmonize them as commentary letters or other, kind of based on their length, because we know from the previous work that longer ones tend to be commentaries, shorters tend to be letters. So in contrast, when it came to the time to submit limits, along with the reference limits and peer review policies, these were sometimes mentioned at the more prominent journals, but rarely stated at random journals. And then the strictest limits we found allowed just 400 words in one journal, and then at another journal, there was only 4 weeks after publication of the target article for critiques to be submitted. So I'm sure you can all agree that these are some pretty serious constraints for people wanting to write, thoughtful critiques. If you only have 4 weeks and a few hundred words to do it, it's going to be a bit of a stretch. So then next we looked at the prevalence of post-publication critiques. So this time we're looking at the 2 different samples of articles, and we had a total of 202 articles. If you're wondering why we had 101 in each sample, it's simply because mild accounting error, like when we were going through and deciding whether or not to include them, we just accidentally ended up with an additional article in each sample and decided to keep it. So among all of these articles, we found a grand total of 1 single critique, which was very exciting when we found it. I remember it was a Friday afternoon, so I kind of made my week. But here it is. Here's what it looks like. So it's just kind of a little comment in the recommended articles to the side. In fact, we almost missed it because I didn't see this when I was looking at it, and it was one of our secondary coders. So all our data had the initial coding, which I did, and then secondary coders to kind of double check my work. And yeah, so this is how we found this 1 critique. It kind of shows you how sketchy it can be, because we had a little bit of back and forth about whether we should actually include this as a critique, because those recommended articles can theoretically change. And normally when you have critiques to articles, or ideally, they should be clearly linked as part of the article. Like kind of sometimes you'll see them up near the title. So one other thing we looked at was whether or not journals were listed members of COPE, which is the Committee on Publication Ethics, because we were curious to know whether that would have any bearing on the critique policies. But as you can see, it did not. And while prominent journals were more likely to be COPE members in general, in neither sample did it seem to have any bearing on the likelihood of them explicitly stating that they would accept critique submissions. And this may be kind of surprising to those of you who might be aware that one of the core COPE practices is journal willingness to accept critiques. However, when we look at their language around defining post-publication critique, we see that it includes journals allowing critiques to be posted on externally moderated sites, which is a little bit strange because I don't think any journal has the power to stop people posting critiques on external sites such as PubPeer. So basically, with this clause included, all journals technically meet this requirement. So it absolves journals of any actual responsibility. But you may have noticed here that I've put a little caveat that this definition was just from 21 to 2024. And that's because they're currently updating these guidelines for 2025. And they said that they retired the previous code of conduct in 2024, yet we're now in October, and as of Monday, when I went to check, they still hadn't updated these guidelines. So it kind of remains to see whether this definition and the policies around post-publication critiques will change in any meaningful way, and more importantly, whether COPE will actually enforce that journals follow these standards to maintain membership. So incidentally, some of what I thought were actually the most interesting findings, you won't notice unless you kind of really go through the supplementary material. And that's because during the piloting period of this study, so before we actually started collecting data, we just checked that we're all on the same page collecting data, practicing with the Google Forms that we were using, and comparing our responses to what Tom had previously found in the initial study. So from just the 10 journals that we piloted this with, we found quite a few instances of policies that had changed and where they'd removed critique formats since 2019, so just 4 years later. So first, Current Biology had changed their definition of correspondence to invite only, so it no longer met our definition for being peer initiated. Science has removed their technical comments format, which was previously a 1,500 word comment format where people could submit critiques. And I think that was actually quite well utilized, so it was sad to see that they'd removed that. And then several publishers had removed web comments from their sites. So when we noticed this with Cell Press, we're pretty sure it's Cell Press was brought up by Elsevier, I think, not long after Tom's initial study. And so he actually emailed them to ask kind of why did you remove web comments? And I think the response was just no one really used them. So we decided to discontinue it. Because, Elsevier, very small publisher, they don't have a lot of disposable income. I'm sure it was a bit of a strain on their funds to continue that. And then regarding APA journals, so they actually did have web comments when I first started collecting data, but a couple weeks into it, I noticed that some of the APA journals I was looking at no longer had these comments available. And so they'd actually discontinued it during data collection. So then all the people who second coded it, coded it as not having any critique formats. So they were, fine. At the end, all those journals, didn't have any critique formats. I emailed them to ask why, and I never got a response from them, which was a little bit sad. So I imagine it's probably for the same reason that these just weren't really that well utilized, but I think even if they're rarely utilized, having that option available is still incredibly important, especially for these big publishers that are often for profit. To take away these avenues for people to submit critiques, I think is a little, bit not great, I guess. So, like any study, we did have our limitations. The first being that we had a very narrow operational definition, but this was very deliberate because we did want to focus specifically on journal accountability. If we were a bit broader with that, or included pub peer comments, then we probably would have found more instances of critiques and things like this. But yeah, we really wanted to stick to journals agreeing to publish critiques in their own publications. Second, we relied solely on explicit journal policy statements. So there is a chance that these journals would be open to publishing critiques if they were sent in. But nevertheless, the fact that they don't have this explicitly stated anywhere on their site is probably going to dissuade people from writing in because it does take time and effort to write up a thoughtful critique. If you don't know if it's going to get published or if it's going to get even acknowledged by the editors, then you might not be as willing to write it in. And I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories of people writing in, maybe not formal critiques, but definitely some form of critique about articles in journals and then just never hearing from the journal again, having their critiques completely ignored, or getting a very disappointing response. So I think having, that explicit policy kind of gives them a little bit more accountability, that then there is maybe some pressure to actually publish them occasionally. There is also the potential that we miss critiques due to unclear links. As you saw, the single critique that we did find wasn't really clearly labeled as a critique. So there could have been more examples of this. So critiques might be a little bit higher than what we estimated. But then again, if they're not really clearly linked to the point where I missed them when we are specifically looking for them, then I think it's highly unlikely that readers who might not be, who probably aren't looking specifically for critiques, it would be very unlikely that they would actually notice them. So even though this is a limitation, I think it's quite a small limitation. Like, it doesn't really interfere with the purpose of what we were trying to do. And then finally, the frequency of critique submissions remains unknown. So we have no idea whether any of these journals get any critiques, whether they commonly get critiques, or how often critiques do get published when they are submitted. Again, we know from anecdotal stories that it's probably not very common that it happens, but it would still be a very interesting thing to know if we could empirically study that. So I think the final questions then are, how can we improve critique culture? Because we know there's a lot of problems in science, especially in psychology. It is very openly talked about that there's a lot of studies with methodological issues, with statistical issues, with just issues in general. So why are there so few critiques? I think the first thing that we need to do is have better journal policies. So it should be a requirement really for journals to accept critiques, especially if they are members of COPE. So I'll be really curious to see whether those guidelines change and whether that kind of enforces journals to accept critiques more. We think that they should be flexible in their limits and ideally have no time to submit limits, because there really shouldn't be any time to submit limits on, on science. Just because it was 10 years ago doesn't mean that it's not important. We can also have more critique writing initiatives. For those of you who come to ReproT journal clubs, you might be aware that there have been some efforts to write post-publication critiques of the articles that we discuss at the journal club. I'm kind of ashamed to admit that we've been struggling to get that off the ground at our Melbourne Journal Club, because it is difficult. I think that's kind of one of the reasons why we need initiatives like this. It takes time and effort to submit critiques. And for younger academics, so PhD candidates or early career researchers, it might be a little bit daunting. If you're writing a critique of someone who's established in the field, it could negatively affect your career or could have consequences, or it can just be scary to critique someone else's work. So having that kind of group environment to support it, I think, is a really great idea. And then for academics who are older or more established, they might not have the time to really sit down and write out these thoughtful critiques, especially if you're seeing issues in a lot of different articles. You might not have time to write really thought out critiques of all of them. And then, of course, having critique writing guidelines, I think, is also really important. So if you haven't heard of COSIG, it's the Collection of Open Science Integrity Guides. So they just released a PDF this year, I think it was just a few months ago, that gives a really good idea of how to write critiques, what kind of language to use, what kind of things you can look for in critiques. So this specific guide is kind of more for posting pub-peer comments, which I still think is a great thing to do. I think even if you can't get a critique published, being able to publish on a site like pub-peer is incredibly important, for people to have those outlets. And so this guide kind of goes through, one, how to spot problems, and then how to write them up in a diplomatic way and submit them. I'm happy to post a link to that guide if anyone's interested. Because, well, as I've got the quote there from Samin and Alex, a scientific community that encourages transparency while discouraging criticism is not one that prioritizes self-correction. I think especially in meta research, we talk a lot about this, but then still we're struggling to find the time to really write up these critiques. So I think meta researchers is probably doing a better job of this than most other fields. So I just wanted to end with another quote by Robert Mertens. So I mentioned the Miltonian norms earlier. One of them is organized skepticism. And he writes about this that it is rather a diffuse, frequently vague apprehension that skepticism threatens the current distribution of power. Conflict becomes accentuated whenever science extends its research to new areas towards which there are institutionalized attitudes, or whenever other institutions extend their control over science. And that was written in 1942, so during World War II, which I think these are really quite powerful words. And I think they're just as true today as they were back then. In the last year or so, we've definitely seen a lot of attacks, a lot of changes happening in science, particularly with governmental control and certain institutions that are trying to control the narrative around science. So it's more important than ever, I think, that we speak up and we voice when we see things that aren't quite right or when we see problems that we call them out. And I think in academia, we are kind of naturally inclined to self-censor. Whenever we write, we always have to be very careful what we write and make sure that we're always very measured, which is a good thing. But then I think it can also lead to us having a tendency to self-censor sometimes more often than we should. So I think starting a culture where it is okay to critique each other's and that we're not, afraid of receiving criticism ourselves and that we can actually have conversations around these difficult topics is really important for the advancement of science as a whole. Okay, so to summarize, we found that unfortunately a minority of psychology journals have post-publication critique policies, and we really believe that all journals should offer at least one format for this. Limits can be overly restrictive when they're stated, and length limits should be flexible and with no time limits. As we noted, there were a number of formats that allowed for 2,000 words or more, so it's not completely dire. I don't want to be like everything is terrible. There are definitely journals that are doing better job than others, and I think those journals really should be applauded for their work. But unfortunately, even with these in place, prevalence remains fairly rare at around 1% in the literature in general, and even less in less prominent journals. So yeah, I think we really need to find ways to encourage more open critical discourse, to recognize people for their contributions when they do contribute. I think that's starting to happen a little bit more now with more talk around fraud and the implications of that people are starting to get more recognized when they bring forward, problems or issues in articles, and they do so in a, credible and well-managed way. But yeah, I think that we could definitely be doing better in that department. Yeah, so thank you all for coming to listen, and big thanks to the reproducibility crew for inviting me. And I look forward to your questions and comments.